Hello and welcome to Dingle Lit, the Dingle Literary Festival. My name is Alex Clark. I'm so delighted to be joined for our final event, our finale event of 2021 by Omar Akkad, author of American War and What Strange Paradise, his new book, which is what we'll mainly be talking about today, but I think we may range all over the place. Omar, welcome. It is 6 o'clock in the morning where you are calling from. Am I right?
That is correct. Thank you very much for doing this. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
It's wonderful to have you, and let's dive straight into these two novels. You had a whole life before you started writing fiction as a journalist, and it's not hard to see how what you discovered in your many assignments, which included being in Afghanistan, in Guantanamo, covering Black Lives Matter, has fed into the novels that you've written, but they are just so rich with humanity. I wanted to start really just by saying that American War is a futuristic novel. It's a novel that imagines a civil war in America driven by ecocide and climate catastrophe. So I have to say, as speculative fiction goes, it doesn't feel very speculative right now. It feels like that is becoming reality. But What Strange Paradise kind of keys into what is going on right now, to stories that we see all the time, stories of migrant boats that founder in seas with their cargo, their human cargo, often smuggled human cargo, just flung into the water and left for dead. And that seems a really realistic and contemporary story. But I started thinking about it and I was thinking, well, this idea of a boy who is washed up on a strange island, these are stories that we've been telling each other for centuries. And it seemed to me there was something quite fable-like about it. And the power of the kind of realism and the fabula was what really drove the novel for me. That's enough from me. Tell me about it from your perspective.
No, I mean, thank you for that. That's incredibly reassuring. In my very limited career as a person who makes stuff up, my whopping over and over, where I intend the book to do one thing, and then it comes out into the world, and it does something else entirely, and readers read it in an entirely different way. That was the case with American War, certainly, where I thought I was writing one kind of book, and then it ends up coming out 4 months into the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. And suddenly it's on this all these lists of the first novels of the Trump era and the books you need to read to understand. And that's been great for my royalty statement, don't get me wrong, but in terms of what I intended versus how the book is read, there's a chasm between those two things. In the case of What Strange Paradise, I wanted to take a comforting fable that Westerners have been telling their kids for the last 100 years. And I wanted to invert it. I wanted to use it to tell a different kind of story. And I was very much obsessed with the fable of Peter Pan. When we talk about Peter Pan today, we usually talk about something like Peter Pan syndrome, which is the man who refuses to stop acting like a child. The origins of the story are the exact opposite. J.M. Barrie, when he was a kid, his older brother died in a skating accident, and it crushed the family. His mom never recovered. One of the ways that his mom tried to comfort herself was to talk about this idea of, well, at least he won't grow old. And so that's the origins of that particular story. And so I was writing about fantasy. I was writing about, in my mind, the collision of two fantasies. One that originates in the part of the world where I now live, which is that all these people coming over here are barbarians at the gate, and we need to build bigger gates. And then the other fantasy headed from originating where I grew up in the Middle East and sort of that part of the world, which is if I can just make it over there, everything will be okay. And so much of the book takes place at the collision of these two fantasies. And so I needed the whole thing to have the feel of a fable. So it's very much based on Peter Pan, but it's not one of those stories that, unless you're really familiar with Peter Pan and the life of J.M. Barrie, it's not something that sort of is going to jump out of the page at you. It's much more beneath the surface, but it is grounded in the idea of fantasy and a fable.
Yes, you do not need, we should say for readers, although of course everybody is familiar with Peter Pan, you do not need to be a J.M. Barrie expert to read and understand and gain a lot from this book. But I'm really interested to hear you mention Barrie and children's literature. I know that when you were growing up, Little Women was hugely important to you. It was a book that you discovered kind of by chance. It was what was available to you as you were growing up in, well, first in Egypt and then in Qatar. You grew up with kind of, I suppose, limited access. The books that you had were the thing, what you read was what you had, what was available to you. And it's fascinating nonetheless that children are such an important part of your fiction, and children's literature seems to be a sort of bedrock for you.
Yeah, I mean, so I grew up in Qatar, and Qatar at the time had no libraries or bookstores of any kind. We had the school library. I went to a British high school, and so I still have nightmares about GCSEs or O levels or whatever they call them. You know, that whole structure. But there was this library, and whatever books the teachers brought back with them from their trips to Europe or whatever, that was it. And I stumbled onto this book, Little Women, and it was the most exotic thing in the world. The lives of these girls, like, it was so far outside the context of any kind of experience I'd had. And to this day, I'm terrified of going back and rereading this book in case it's sort of, I look at it and say, oh no, this was not what I remember it. I don't know if I write children characters well. I don't know if I do it in any kind of way that I certainly, the reason I'm drawn to that part of life is because I think it is the site of our only real honest interaction with the world before all of the convolutions and various obligations and lies we have to tell ourselves to get through the day, before any of that kicks in. And since I write a lot about what makes me angry, and what makes me angry is usually systemic, it's a systemic form of injustice, colliding that against, or passing it through the prism of childhood, which is, in my mind, a fundamentally honest interaction with the world, I think allows me to get at the things that make me angry in a way that crystallizes, at least for me, if not for the reader. If I fail entirely to make the reader feel the same thing I do, at least for me, it crystallizes what it is about it that feels so unjust when I pass it through that particular prism. But again, that's entirely separate from whether I do it properly or not. I just have a magnetic attraction to that period of life. It feels to me like an honest ground from which to make stuff up.
Well, here at the beginning of What Strange Paradise, we have a small boy. He is perhaps the only survivor, we're not entirely sure, of a capsized migrant vessel. Amir then meets another child, Vanna, who is herself in a strange kind of position on this Greek island that they find themselves on. Her family have come there also in pursuit of a kind of dream. Just tell us a bit about that, these two kids and how they meet one another and what happens.
Sure, yeah. So they're my Peter and Wendy. And to give you a sense of how convoluted the references to Peter Pan are in this book, Amir is prince in Arabic. In a lot of Christian traditions in Arabic, Peter is considered the prince of the apostles. Utu is the Mesopotamian or Sumerian god who in physical appearance most closely resembles Pan. This is the kind of stuff I'm talking about when I say I'm referencing Peter Pan. It's not the most overt thing in the world. I grew up in a place called Qatar. Qatar, it's a little peninsula sticking out of Saudi Arabia. One of the things about Qatar, in addition to being pound for pound maybe the richest country on earth because of all their oil and gas money, it's also a place where 90% of the population is from somewhere else. They've all come in to cash in on that revenue, to cash in on the oil and gas money. And so you'd be at the beach or something, you'd be playing around. I remember this distinctly many, many times when I was a kid. You'd see another kid on the beach, and that natural instinct to make friends kicks in, but you know that there's a good chance you don't speak the same language, you don't come from the same culture, and so you very quickly develop this sort of makeshift, hand gestures and whatever you need to do to bridge that communication divide. And so a lot of that works its way into the relationship between Amir and Vanna. Amir washes up on this island that's very much based on the eastern coast of Crete, but is a fantastical place. I've changed the flora and fauna, and I've sort of created a kind of fantasy place. Vanna, it's sort of it's never explicitly stated, but if you read between the lines, she's half Greek, half Swedish. And so again, Wendy apparently, I don't know if this story is true, but apparently Wendy comes from one of J.M. Barrie's childhood friends who wanted to call him Friendy, but couldn't pronounce the R, and so said Wendy, and apparently that's where Wendy comes from. I don't know if any of this is true, but I choose to believe it's true. Van is the Swedish for friend, Vanna, that's where the name comes from. And I think of her as somebody who's trying to figure out how to be a decent person, knowing full well that most of her advantages in life were not earned. They were effectively accidents of birth, her skin color, her ethnicity, her place in the culture. And she's trying to figure out how to be a decent human being in spite of that sort of lottery aspect of life. And the relationship between the two of them, I think, is what carries the book. Usually it's a character that carries the story for me. And in What Strange Paradise, I think it's a relationship that does the...
I mean, that relationship is partly because obviously they don't have a language in common. They are communicating via gestures, via just feelings a lot of the time. But that relationship partly seems to come about because both have a sort of integral understanding of an abandonment, of a family fracture, of a world kind of turned upside down. I mean, of course, you know, as you say, Vanna is in many ways, certainly in global terms, hugely privileged, but her life is not particularly happy. Her own family is fractured. She doesn't really have a place. Amir has had the most extraordinary upheaval and trauma. And yet he somehow seems to have a kind of, for such a small child, a kind of strange calm and settledness. I'm just interested in how you develop these two characters and their kind of contours.
Yeah, so this is one of the things about both books, about American War and What Strange Paradise. American War, one of the central criticisms was, you know, this isn't how a second American Civil War would go down. And I would say you're absolutely right. It's not what I'm trying to do. And I think there's a similar element with What Strange Paradise and the sort of mechanics of that journey. The book, for lack of a better phrase, steals from a lot of different places. It steals from the Odyssey, from the Book of Nicodemus, which is part of the Apocrypha, from Paradise Lost. There's all kinds of stuff that I've pulled from all different places. But one of the really interesting things that happened, you know, I thought that the trick I was employing was fairly straightforward, and I thought the book would be read a certain way. And then the first 4 people to read the book had 4 entirely different interpretations of what the hell was going on in this story. And that's when I knew that things were not going to go my way on that front. One of the things about Amir's place in this world is that his agency, his sense of having some say over what happens from the very beginning is diminished because he's a child, you know, but also in the sense of being swept up in the great currents of geopolitics and sort of what happens to a human being when they are at the center of forces that over which they have absolutely no control. And so I think for him, the calm that comes over him, I think, is in part a structural thing. And I don't want to talk too much about, I don't want to give away too much of the story, but it's part a structural thing of what he's doing on that island and what's happening on this island, but also the sense of having never really known anything different. You know, from a very young age, you are put in a position where the world is this giant machine full of gears, and the gears are spinning, and you're trying not to just get eaten up in between them. You start to believe that that's all the world is, that agency is as much a fantasy as safety or as any one of these pillars that in another life might be just taken for granted.
I mean, I'm so interested in the way that you sketch those aspects of his life, and we do get glimpses of whole other worlds and experiences. His father is no longer around. His mother has remarried his uncle. They have another baby, but they've also, their journey has started a long time before they actually or he actually gets on the boat. And I mean, this is a really short book, actually, and a very kind of sparely written one. It's incredibly compact. But I noticed just little sort of vignettes, and one of them comes quite early on in the book when the family is staying with a distant relative in Damascus. And it becomes apparent that that relative is essentially a kind of, believes in the regime, doesn't really believe that the trauma that they've gone through. And I found that really interesting because, of course, from the rest of the world, we're used to not seeing the whole of a society. Everything is mediated through reporting that may be under heavy restrictions, and of course our own prejudices. And that was just a tiny vignette, but I wondered why you put it in there and how you wanted it to resonate with us.
Yeah, so I've been living in the US. I've been living in North America since I was 16. I've been living in the US for the better part of a decade. And a few years ago, I went back to Europe for the first time in a long time. When we lived in Qatar, we used to go to London and Paris all the time because Qatar gets way too hot to stay in the summers. You have to get the hell out. But I hadn't been for a long time, and I'd gotten used to the American scale of things. One of the things about America is everything is just very big. Like the average hotel room, even if you go to a motel or something, is just way bigger than the same thing in Europe. So anyway, I end up in Sweden where I have an aunt who lives, and it's my first time visiting. And we're staying at a friend of a friend's apartment. And I walk in, and my brain had been so used to American scale that I walk in, I think this place is tiny. And you open a closet and a bed falls out, and the use of space is so incredibly efficient. And I think of the book that way. The book is very small, and it's got all kinds of things hiding behind cupboards and sort of, that sort of thing. I have a friend, a fellow writer named David Cheriandu, who wrote this beautiful book called Brother a few years ago. And he was talking about how in the editing process, every time he edited this book, it would get a little bit shorter. And he was worried if he kept editing, it would eventually disappear and there would just be no book. I had a similar experience with What Strange Paradise. It kept getting shorter every time I edited. That particular scene is based on something that somebody told me once. We were talking about the massacres in Syria. These are outright massacres that mark that civil war. And he said, no, none of that stuff happens. It's all filmed on a soundstage. Al Jazeera just films it on a separate soundstage. And it was pointless. Somebody once said that you can't reason somebody out of a position that they didn't reason themselves into. And it was that kind of conversation. It was pointless to have a debate about it. This person needed to believe this in order for the rest of their worldview to make any sense at all. And so you have this situation in the book where this family has fled the bombing of their home and are now being told by a relative that never happened, that the thing they experienced personally never happened. And it sounds absurd. And it's one of those moments where fiction has trouble mirroring reality because reality is intruding on the realm of the fictional. And those are difficult situations to try and get in the story. But that's a thing that happened, and I believe continues to happen. People just believe whatever scaffolding they need to do in order to hold up the rest of the reality.
That's an incredibly difficult thing to confront. Well, if you simply want to have a kind of rational view of what's going on in the world, it's also especially difficult if you're trying to make fiction, and even more so if you have worked for such a long time as a journalist, bringing stories back from places like Kandahar, from places like Guantanamo Bay, and showing people what you have seen with photographs, with words. And now we know that we're in the era of fake news, manufactured belief, people, as you say, believing what they need to believe. But how on earth can that be combated in the face of such kind of determination not to believe it?
It's a good question. And for me, it is, excluding climate change, the sort of single existential question of our time, which is, I live in the US and it does feel quite often like you're living in silos of parallel reality. I mean, I live near Portland, Oregon, which is a very sort of progressive city on its surface, at least. When we were looking to buy a house, we couldn't afford anything in the city. So we started driving, 20 minutes out of town this way, 20 minutes out of town that way. And there were two separate neighborhoods that got automatic vetoes from us because somebody was flying a Confederate flag. we're 3,000 miles away from the nearest Civil War battle site, but that's the kind. You move out of certain regions and you are in an entirely different country. Not only a different country, but a different version of reality. Places where the vaccine has microchips in it that track your movement, or there's a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. that runs a pedophile ring for Democratic senators in the basement, which, again, I'm not inventing these conspiracy theories. These are things that are believed by many, many people in this country. And I don't know how you fix that, because the sort of common framework has been so fractured that I can't find any piece of common ground with somebody who believes these things. And so all I try to do, and this was true in journalism, but weirdly enough, it's even more true in the realm of fiction. I try to have some kind of documentary evidence of reality as it existed. And is that going to do anything? No. The kind of person whose mind I most want to change with books like American War and What's Strange Paradise is never going to pick those books up in the first place. And so you're kind of playing a losing game to begin with. But at the very least, I can say, in the realm of all of these malicious fantasies, here is another one that at least centers humanity, or centers decency, or centers kindness. It's not nearly good enough, but at the very least, it represents some kind of resistance to this very nihilistic idea that whatever the hell you believe is more important than what reality is.
I mean, there's also, I guess, you're absolutely right. If people are so invested in believing something, it's extremely hard to confront that. But what I guess it can do is confront indifference or sort of inertia. And I guess that's what you can do when you show people things either through reportage or fiction. And one of the things, again, that goes through this book, that goes through What Strange Paradise, is the idea of this resort, which also has kind of elements of climate change in it. You note the species, as you say, invented by you. The birds are a kind of constant throughout it. But of course, there are the hotels. There are the tourists who might have their day ruined by seeing a dead body on the beach. That is clearly something you wanted to, in a kind of low-key way, register a sense of outrage about, or at least that's how I felt about it.
Yeah, you're one of the few people to bring it up. I grew up in one of those places. When my dad needed to get the hell out of Egypt in the 80s, the political, well, for the entirety of my life, the political and economic. In Qatar, working as an accountant in the hotels, I spent a lot of time in this hotel, which was the only luxury hotel in Doha at the time. Now it's sort of like the tiniest one. Is that its primary purpose was as a sheltering place from whatever the reality of the location might actually provide. The point is that you pay a lot of money and then you are treated to a very well curated version of the experience of being in that place. And that, more than anything, I feel like, people say they go to places to see the scenery or to, visit this attraction or whatever, but I think the all-encompassing reason is to get a very well curated, pleasant version of the experience of being there.
Yes.
And so I remember when we were very young, the first Gulf War came along and the US set up a military base, and we were playing around there was this little basketball court at this hotel. It was part of the sort of recreation area. And these two very broad guys in ridiculous Hawaiian shirts and khaki shorts show up, and we knew Indian Americans, and they showed up, and we were kids, and they were sort of humoring us, playing basketball with us, and we were in awe of these people, this massive muscular guy, and at one point one of them just drops to the ground, just fully like that. He'd suffered heat stroke. He had no idea how to be in this environment. these guys who were just sitting around in the resort feeling like this was their R&R, this was their day off, and they're surrounded by tropical drinks and people are catering to their every whim. And one guy just sort of dropped. It was one of those times where you see the experience as it is curated bump up against reality, which is not a curated thing. And I think resorts are a central place where that sort of thing happens.
And of course, they're surrounded, as you portray, by people who have been sent in, I mean, authorities, forces, peacekeeping organizations, aid organizations, who have also been sent to manage what is happening. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about one of the characters, the Colonel in the book, who in many ways is someone we are so antipathetic to. He has been sent to manage, these children, these bodies, these people who are washing up on the shores. He has apparently no mercy and no, he lacks a kind of humane approach. And yet he seemed to me quite a complicated character, quite ambiguous, because he had a kind of clear-sightedness about him. I don't know if that was how you intended it to come across.
Yeah, I often say that this is something I should be taking up with my therapist, but the characters that stick out to me in all my work more than any other are always the villains. They're always the bad guys in the story. And this Colonel Kethros is the one who sticks out to me most in this book. He stays with me. When I was in high school, I had this physics teacher who was obsessed with this idea that you should never memorize formulas. You should always be able to derive them from first principles. So I'll give you distance, I'll give you position, speed, whatever, and you figure out the formulas from there. Don't just memorize the thing. And I think Colonel Kethros in particular is a man who has memorized the formulas of manhood and what is traditionally considered sort of masculine strength, the chivalry, the sort of firm handshake, all of that stuff. He's memorized all those formulas and they've become the sort of load-bearing beams of his life and worldview. But he has absolutely no idea how to derive them from basic principles of kindness or humanity or basic decency. And so what you have is this very brittle surface layer understanding of what it means to be a man. And anytime it's fractured, anytime reality fractured, the only thing holding it up is violence. The only thing underneath it is violence. And so you have this strange situation where, for example, at one point he's at the beach side and he sees this girl drowning and he rushes in. He's my Captain Hook character. Instead of missing a hand, he's missing a foot. So he's limping on his prosthetic leg and he jumps into the water and he does this very chivalrous thing. He saves her life. And then he slaps her father for not acting with enough decorum that he feels a resident of this island should show without, in this kind of setting. And so he's this man, I think, who has based his entire life around a surface understanding, a veneer of what it means to be a strong man. And anytime that's challenged, he descends into violence almost instantly.
I mean, that's a really, really striking scene. And also, there was a moment that I just thought, wow, when one of his soldiers says to him, what are we doing? And he basically says, well, you can ask that question or you can be a soldier. You can't be both. And that kind of seemed to me to go back to what you were saying at the beginning about the system, about the systemic nature. Yes, it's to do with individuals and their own conceptions of duty and masculinity and law and order and all sorts of things. But this system is very, very hard to dismantle.
Yeah, I mean, it's at one point, one of his soldiers sort of betrays him a little, and he's not angry about it. He says, finally, he admits it very quickly that he's betrayed him. He sort of cracks under pressure, this young soldier. And Kethros says something like, imagine how little would get done if all men had spines. He's a big believer in systems and order and sort of this idea that the only thing that separates us from all these barbarians at the gate is the idea that we have systems in place. But at the same time, these systems have failed him repeatedly. and he's sort of experienced firsthand how inhuman and cold they can be, how easily cruelty flows through these systems. And so he's in an odd place of having to defend this thing on which he has based his entire personality and worldview, knowing full well that there's a rot at the core of it. And I mean, I think he's an extreme example, but I think all of us have to deal with this in one way or another in our lives, right? Knowing full well that the system that's keeping the lights on right now is the same one that's helping destroy the planet for my kids. And what is my role in that? That's a very uncertain place to be. And I suspect to a certain extent, that's where all my writing resides, with the stuff I've written, and also anything I may write is going to be in that strange relationship with complicity over these systems that are immensely beneficial to our daily lives while also being immensely ruinous.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I wonder if I can sort of ask you where we go then when we think about what can be done, because it's often that's what drives inertia, isn't it? It's a sense of kind of hopelessness. What can I possibly do? I think people feel it in the face of climate change. They feel it in huge humanitarian crises. And of course, they're all tiny actions, but we worry that they don't add up to, a hill of beans. How is it for you as journalist, as novel writer? I mean, how do you approach what can we do? What can I do?
I just finished reading this book. It's a piece of nonfiction by a guy named Evan Osnos. It's called Wildland, and it's sort of a book about the many ways in which America is falling apart. And at one point he's in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is the hedge fund capital of America. It's where all these incredibly wealthy hedge fund managers live in these gated, mansions. And he's at a charity dinner, and these people are raising ludicrous sums of money to save the owls or whatever the hell they're sort of into that given week. And he's talking to one person, and this guy says, these people, these very wealthy people, they love charity, but they're very uncomfortable with justice, because justice requires them to take a side. Charity requires them to give an infinitesimally small piece of their immense wealth and feel good about themselves for the rest of the day. Justice requires them to take sides. I think one of the defining traits of how the Western world in particular has looked at the so-called refugee crisis is through the lens of charity. That it is a good-hearted thing to empathize with these people and provide them with some semblance of safety. And the unspoken corollary being that these people should then remain grateful for the rest of their lives, that is their role now, is eternal gratitude. And to be perfectly honest, what I want to do is destroy that entire worldview. And I want to think of these things not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of justice. There's no part of my worldview that isn't in some way influenced by the fact that I come from a part of the world that was colonized for a very long time. And obviously that colors how I look at the world. But I would like to think that irrespective of that, if I'm looking at a situation where we've created a society where somebody's basic desire for home and safety is considered a radical act, then the problem is not with that person wanting home and safety. The problem is with the society we've constructed. And so that's my very roundabout way to say that these solutions should be firmly rooted in justice rather than charity. I think that's the first step to all of this.
I felt there was a kind of little, I don't know, hint of that just in the name of the hotel in the book, the Hotel Xenios, because it kind of refers to this ancient Greek concept of hospitality, doesn't it? And hospitality not in the sense of please come and have dinner with me so that we can be sociable, but in a fundamental obligation you have to another human being to offer them shelter. And that's what seemed to me to run through the book.
Yeah, I think that is fairly accurate. I used to think that these, I still don't know what I want my books to do. I used to have a very sort of solid conception of how I, and the more I publish work, the more I realize that that's a fool's errand. And so I never know what I want these books to do anymore. But I hope that if they do something, that it's related to that concept you just discussed.
So just tell us before we send you back to the writing desk what you are working on now or hope to be working on in the future.
A couple of very ill-advised short stories will be appearing in various anthologies and magazines over the next couple of months, including the first time I've written comedy in 20 years, which will come as a surprise given how incredibly depressing my novels are. I got my start writing comedy, and so there's a humor short story that's coming out in an anthology in the spring. I wrote the introduction to a new edition of Alf Layla wa Layla, which is 1001 Nights, Arabian Nights. There's a new translation coming out. It's gorgeous. And it's, I think, the first time it's ever been translated by an Arab woman. And they asked me to write the introduction. So I did the least amount of work of anybody involved in this project, but I've been bragging about it endlessly because it's a beautiful collection. It's really well done, and it's coming out in November. I'm very proud to have played a very small part in that. And then probably sleeping for a month. It's been the book launch has gone on for a while, so some downtime, and then.
Well, I'm glad it has though, and I'm just going to take issue with something you said there. I didn't find this What Strange Paradise depressing. I mean, I found it had some very saddening and bracing and sobering things in it, but I found it a kind of hopeful book in the sense that it laid out reality and it made us look at something, and I didn't find it depressing at all. And I also think that it's not for you to say whether your short stories are ill-advised. I think your readers have to judge that. So we shall look out with interest and for all your projects. Omar, I'm so incredibly grateful to you for joining us at 6 a.m. No less a thing, from Portland, Oregon. And this is just really a wonderful book. If you're watching and you've been minded to find out about Peter Pan and a fantasy, Eastern Crete and Amir and Vanna, and I highly recommend that you do. You can use the buy this book button. We really, really hope to welcome Omar to Ireland proper when we finally get through this pandemic. But in the meantime, Omar, thank you so much for joining us. We're very grateful. And thank you to you for joining us.